Welcome to panel 6 at Tackling Insurgent Ideologies in a Pandemic World. This conference, which was meant to have taken place in Delhi earlier in the summer, of course, got pushed back because of lockdowns around the world with the pandemic. And we decided to take the conversations virtually. Now, this has been an advantage in many ways because many of our panelists here who we've invited in the past to live conferences in Delhi have been unable to attend, but we're happy to have them with us in person. Vidya and Eric, that's basically for both of you, but thank you both for being with us. So the panel now, before I hand over to our moderator, Vidya Ramalingam, who's founder of Moonshot CVE in the United Kingdom, is called De-Radicalisation, Overlapping Mandates and Conceptual Confusion. What exactly do we mean by the term? What exactly are the drivers of radicalization? We need to understand who's going to be looking at policies and practice when it comes to engaging in de-radicalization activity. To talk about that, we have with us Eric Rosen, who is the director of the Prevention Project and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's worked extensively in the CVE space the last few years. We have Jesse Frankerson, who is the Director of Dialogue and Communications at the Hidayah Center in the UAE, also working extensively in the CVE space. Sajid Shapu, who's a Senior Indian Police Service officer and a PhD scholar at Princeton. Sajid was one of the first officers to be inducted into India's National Investigation Agency and has worked on counterterrorism from the law enforcement perspective. And Sumaya Sheikh, who's a neuroscientist and a researcher in violent aggression at the Linköping University Hospital in Sweden. Sumaya, I hope I got of your university right. The pronunciations can be difficult. And Vidya, with that, I'm going to hand over to you for this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Maya. Hello and welcome to all attendees of this panel, and thank you to the Observer Research Foundation for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to be moderating a session on de-radicalization with such an interesting group of panelists to lead this conversation with. And maybe I'll just start by saying that, you know, my connection to this topic goes many years back. I started my career in this field by spending several years doing field work with white nationalist extremists and working on setting up programs that would help to pull people out of these movements. So it's something very close to my own heart. I'm going to get started and set out some questions for each of our panelists, and we'll keep this as a conversation for the first 40 minutes. And then we'll reserve the last 20 minutes of the conversation for Q&A with the audience. For the audience, you'll see a space at the bottom of your screen, a chat function where you can submit questions. And we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible, but just be aware we may not get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So I'm going to kick things off by turning to Eric. Eric, you have a huge amount of experience in the setup of global CVE and PVE initiatives. So it would be great if you could just talk us through, you know, the objectives around de-radicalization programs. Should we be aiming for just disengagement, having people leave movements and reform their lives outside of movements? Or should we be aiming for something which is really around ideological de-radicalization, or both?
The ORFER inviting me, and I actually was going to try to make it out to Delhi for this conference. So I'm really sorry that the pandemic hit for that reason, and many others, of course. In terms of your question, Vidya, I think the challenge with de-radicalization is that, and both of these terms, is they're often used interchangeably, and they really can't be, and they shouldn't be. And I think the way you've laid it out, disengagement is about changing behavior, and de-radicalization is about changing ideology or beliefs. And I think once you start talking about changing ideology or beliefs, you run into a fundamental challenge of human rights and freedom of belief and freedom of religion, which I think, depending on the context in which the de-radicalization program is, a program aiming for de-radicalization is implemented, you might not have the rule of law and legal protections and other traditions that would safeguard the beneficiaries or the targets of those programs from the infringement of the freedoms that I mentioned. And I think for that reason, I think the trend is probably more towards focusing on changing behaviors. But recognizing that ideology is a piece here and has to be part of part of that larger objective. But I think, I think, for example, the European Union, the European Commission's Radicalization Awareness Network argues that it has to be a mixture. And you look at a program, for example, a very well-known CVE program in Denmark in the city of Aarhus. The program focuses on a mixture. It seeks to change extremist views and behaviors while providing a comprehensive support structure to enable reintegration into society. And I think it's that the reintegration into society, the reintegration into the community, that is obviously critical. So even if you're focusing on the beliefs, there's inevitably going to be a practical component of the program and the success of the endeavor that has to be included, and that gets you more towards behavioral change and changing the individual's circumstances. But I'll just conclude by noting that clearly articulating what the purpose of the program is at the outset, in my view, it should be primarily disengagement. That articulation at the outset is critical for then being able to monitor and evaluate its impact, the program's impact. So I think it's still murky, what success means, examples of success in this area, but clearly articulating at the front the objective, again, in my view, more focused on disengagement, but recognizing that there's an ideological piece here often. That would be my sort of concluding remark.
And so, Eric, if we're talking about disengagement, then specifically disengagement, what are the key ingredients or requirements of a successful disengagement program? And from your experience, having worked internationally on these issues.
Yeah. Well, I think there are ingredients that people talk about, like me, for success, but there are not a lot of examples of success. So it's kind of a sort of a contradiction in that we're constantly struggling to find examples of success stories beyond anecdotal, and sort of looking systemically why programs were successful. But yet we have no shortage of ingredients to point to as to what makes for a successful program. So with that caveat, I will sort of highlight some of these ingredients, which sort of the quote unquote expert community is often pointing to. One is evidence-based. So you're relying on a comprehensive, individualized assessment of the particular individual's risks or needs. Ideally, it's conducted by a trained professional, and it's looking across the spectrum of this individual's sort of life history. And then you're tailoring an intervention based on that assessment. And you're taking into account gender and age. You're taking into account the need for it not to be discriminatory based on on religion or ideology. You're taking into account the need to do no harm, making sure that the intervention is gonna to do more good than harm, and that includes a long-term monitoring and evaluation component, and particularly in a fragile and conflict-affected state, that it's designed as part of a wider ecosystem of interventions which taken together can best reduce violent extremism. I would argue that any single intervention disengagement program in a vacuum is in a context where there are so many structural drivers of violent extremism at play, it's going to be very difficult to move the needle on that individual's trajectory absent this larger ecosystem of interventions. I think another key ingredient is that these interventions have to be designed and developed with input from the communities they're seeking to benefit, and not be imposed from the outside, and that they are, wherever possible, designed and implemented through a multidisciplinary approach, that it's not just one professional, it's not just one practitioner, but it's done with a constellation of them, recognizing that individuals who are sort of quote unquote need to be disengaged will often have multiple risks and multiple needs that need to be addressed, and one particular practitioner, whether it's a police officer, a social worker, or a youth worker, on his or her own won't be able to address those risks or needs, and so it needs to be part of a package of professionals. And finally, communication It has to be clearly communicated. The purposes of the program, the goals of the program should be communicated clearly to the beneficiary, to the community, and to the wider public to minimize stigma and suspicion, et cetera, that often surround these kinds of programs. Those are the ingredients to success. I think how many successful programs there are, I think remains in question. What success means it's a big question mark. So I'll leave it at that.
And a quick final question before I move on to the next speaker, Eric. Who's the right entity to lead on these programs, and what role for government?
Again, this is when you're talking about disengagement and you're talking about whether it's individuals who are leaving prison, who've been violent extremist offenders, or those that are returning from conflict zones that may have had association with violent extremism, there are real and perceived security risks associated with those individuals often, and in many cases it's government workers and governments alone that will feel like it's their role to work with these individuals, because a lot of civil society groups may not have training or may have some just unfamiliarity with the terrain. That being said, I think one of the emerging good practices is that in many cases it's going to be civil society that has the better access, that is better able to get the trust of individuals who may have felt burned by the state. I've had a terrible experience interacting with the government over the years. So it's civil society that is really going to be the better placed over the long term to work with these individuals, not just for disengagement purposes, but for actual reintegration purposes. And I think one of the challenges we've seen in the last few years is that governments have been reluctant to loosen the reins on these kinds of programs, to allow for, not just passively allow for civil society to get involved at their own risk, but to actually proactively facilitate civil society involvement and create the policy and legal framework for civil society groups, community-based organizations that are sort of really trusted in the communities into which reintegration will follow disengagement for that to happen. I do think governments, apart from creating that space for civil society to engage, really need to be providing resources to support these kinds of programs, to be providing training for these individuals who are delivering these programs, and to make sure that it's, again, part of a larger policy framework, and that it's not a series of ad hoc initiatives that are emerging, but are actually, this is sort of grounded in a government policy, and so civil society has protections from, they don't have to be worried about getting arrested for working with terrorists, quote unquote terrorists, should they engage in this space, and that there are legal protections for them to prevent that from happening. And I would just finally argue is that civil society perhaps uniquely has this experience working with gangs, other forms of violence in their community, and helping individuals exit from those different forms of violence. And they can really bring all that experience to bear when they are working with those that might have had some experience with or some contact with violent extremism. And that kind of cross learning is really valuable, that I think civil society, maybe also local government, municipalities may have that experience, but certainly the national government is less likely to. So in conclusion, it's going to be a mix of government and non-government actors, but it's really incumbent upon the government to create that space to allow for the non-government piece to flourish, which I think is still an open question in a lot of parts of the world.
Great, thank you, Eric. I'm going to move on to Jesse Francesca. And Jesse, so Eric mentioned from his perspective that there's not a lot of successes that we can point to, even though this work is so needed. So I'm going to ask you the tough question, especially in your role as Hedaya, because I know Hedaya has really worked to build up a kind of repository of successful practices in this space. What kinds of de-radicalization or disengagement programs have proven effective internationally? Oh, Jesse, I think you might be on mute.
Okay. I just want to thank ORF again for being on the panel. I think that this is a perfect opportunity again to be part of such an engaging conversation and an important topic. Ironically, Eric was part of the setup of Hedaya and actually one of the brains behind this organization. So for those that aren't familiar with Hedaya, Hedaya is a apolitical organization that's based in the UAE. That is the International Center of Excellence and is multi-donor funded. And yeah, so to answer your question, it is kind of funny to find I do agree with Eric's assessment. You know, you've got to find the sort of vignettes and the little success stories and look at the evidence-based programs that are out there, which are hard to find because de-radicalization has become a buzzword within the development and within this CVE community, especially in the donor world. So one example that Hedaya can kind of bring to light, and one that we've done some research on, and the program that we're currently running is in Tunisia in partnership with the Tunisian government. So we're working with the Tunisian government on radicalization and also preventing radicalization leading to violent extremism with youth and children. And what it's doing, the program is working with youth and children, which is a very, difficult group to work with. So there are a lot of intricacies that go into that. But one of the things that I think that's really important when you're working and trying to develop a program is making sure that there is a holistic programming that goes into it. So one of the key ingredients for the program is that there is the holistic part and that you are bringing the right people to the table. So while CSOs are one component of that, for this program, they're also bringing together social workers, educators, and psychologists to the table. So they're bringing people that aren't necessarily the usual suspects that you would within CVE programming, for the program as part of the de-radicalization program. So, and the program is also in 3 different phases. So it's a lengthy program, so it's not something that you go in and out as well.
And Jesse, in thinking, so maybe I should have asked this question first, actually, before asking what programs have been effective, but I'll ask it now. What metrics do you actually use to determine if a program is effective? So maybe the Tunisian example is a good example to reference here. How do you know it's successful?
Sorry, you kind of broke up in the middle of that. I think
that's all right. I'll ask the question again, Jesse. So my question was, what metrics do you use to determine that a disengagement program is successful? And if you can reference some examples, even the Tunisia program or others, that would be great.
Sure. So the monitoring and evaluation component is always extremely important, and the metrics are set out at the very beginning. And obviously for the Tunisia program, they were set out in different capacities because of the different phases. So you had behavioral changes that they did, trying to measure whether it was focus groups, and that was seeing before and after. But again, as anyone I think will say in the CVE community, M&E is pretty difficult to measure, and you'll always get the vignettes, and you'll still at some end and at some point still not get the full picture, even as much as you try, because they're softer statistics. It's not like you're running a communications campaign and you can run the analytics. You're looking at perceptions, you're looking at behavioral changes, especially when you're looking at a de-rad program or a disengagement in program. So, the metrics that were set, they're still going on and they're still continuing. But all of the metrics that Hidayah does put in place are evidence-based and ones that are usually, ones that are taken before and after, and also for, at least for Tunisia, place within the different phases.
That's helpful. And then in terms of what's proven ineffective, what can you tell us about learnings internationally from programs around what hasn't worked?
Sure. So I think it goes back to what I was saying about the holistic programming, and it sounds pretty obvious, but it's making sure that the program isn't designed with the mentality of the one-size-fits-all approach, which actually happens a lot in more times than what you would think happens when designing a program, whether it's de-radicalization, disengagement. So it needs to be very tailor-made to the actual country, to the target population. Going back to also what my colleague Eric was saying earlier, looking at the evidence and what some of the drivers are on the ground, because what the drivers are going to affect exactly, what some of the DRAD issues are going to be when you're designing the program. So you kind of have to look at what was before and what drove them to the radicalization process when you're trying to go through the process of de-radicalization. So I think, it goes back to making sure that it's a tailored, bespoke program, looking at the country, not just looking at the country, but looking at the target audience, looking at the push and pull factors, and making sure that that's carefully built into the program.
Great, thank you so much, Jessie. I think we'll move on now to Sajid Shapu. Sajid, so obviously with your long career in policing, can you tell us a little bit about what role law enforcement should play in de-radicalization initiatives?
Thank you, Vidya. At the outset, I thank ORF for organizing this. This is my second year in the conference, and I've really enjoyed it. The meaningful conversations which happen here. So at the outset, I think we need to be clear about certain terms. When the government see radicalization as a process, we tend to tackle it with two-pronged approach. One is the de-radicalization, which is somebody who has already been radicalized, and we are in the process of weaning him off, which is a person who was in the prison for a violent offense. And the second is counter-radicalization, which is kind of a preventative process, which is countering the radicalization as it is happening. So governments all around the world, and especially in South Asia, their accounts of radicalization are predicated in three themes. And here's where the problem lies. One is we think that the radicalization is an observable and a predictable process. There are certain stages that we understand that how a person is radicalized. Once you understand the radicalization, then only you can have your de-radicalization programs. The second theme is that the government has a role to play in it. That government can be the main driver of these de-radicalization programs. And third, and the most important, is that the radicalization is an outcome of certain political and religious cultures within certain communities. So this understanding of radicalization in itself is problematic. Because all things being equal, do we have evidence to say that a person who is more radicalized is more likely to be involved in political violence than a person who is less radicalized? So evidence in the scholarly studies and in also the empirical evidence does not support this. So once we kind of try to understand what actually radicalization is, the faulty understanding of radicalization has led to law enforcements around the world take measures which have been half-baked, which have sometimes been counterproductive. At the same time, I think radicalization, as Eric said, is an important, has been an important ideological narrative, has been an important part of the ongoing narrative on countering the violent terrorism. So governments, when I say government, I mean law enforcement agencies' role in de-radicalization has to be, I think it has to be renegotiated. The way most of the de-radicalization programs in our part of the world are law enforcement driven, and which is a problem because communities in the end do not have a lot of faith in law enforcement agencies, and any program driven by law enforcement agencies, even involving the civil societies, are seen with suspicion. So having said that, I think a proper understanding of radicalization, all the concepts of it, the narrative is very important. And at the same time, law enforcement agencies, in my own opinion, I don't reflect the opinion of anybody in my organization. This is my personal opinion. Should be only a supportive role, wherein civil society can take a lead, but law enforcement is there to provide support.
And so that relationship between law enforcement and civil society in delivering these programs, how can those two, so how can police and civil society work together without stepping on each other's toes and without any issues around deconfliction? If civil society are doing these sorts of interventions, what happens if they're kind of engaging with someone who's currently under investigation by the police? How do you actually make these two coordinate between one another?
So the issue of scope is a major challenge. What is the scope of civil society? It's very fuzzy. So and where should law enforcement step in if the civil society or the members of the civil society who are part of the program are overstepping or kind of breaching the boundaries? That's why I'm not sure. I'm not a big believer in the de-radicalization programs, but that's why I think a close coordination between the two is very important. We have some success. We have had some successes in India. I've been observing the Mumbai police de-radicalization program. They don't project it as a de-radicalization program. They project it as a community policing approach, which I think is a very nice veneer, and which kind of portrays it as one of the many initiatives of law enforcement agencies without targeting a particular community. Having said that, once we talk about de-radicalization program, we are putting in the background one of the major drivers of political violence. Right? When countering violence, we're talking about political violence, and most of the the drivers or the reasons for that have been, there's a large body of literature on that, has been the political issues. So we are keeping that in the background because, one, we don't have the wherewithal, or we don't have the means to, not only means or authority to sort those out, and those issues seem to be best kept in the background because we don't want to talk about them. But having said that, what we have in the hand is, I think, a close coordination between the two, wherein these programs are part of the larger community policing, community outreach programs, wherein you involve people at, as Eric said, at the municipality level, at the local, what we in India call mohalla level, and rather than looking at the drivers or fingerprints of radicalization, law enforcement agencies should do what they are very good at, is look at the fingerprints where the violence is supposed to occur or is likely to occur. So we are good at, we are good at anticipating a crime rather than anticipating who is going to get radicalized, because these are still very, very poorly understood terms.
Right. Thank you so much, Sajid. I think we'll move on now to some questions for Dr. Sumaya Sheikh. Sumaya, can you tell us a bit from a neurobiological perspective, what actually leads to long-term change in an individual who has previously been violent? Sumaya, I think you might be muted.
Okay. Thank you, Divya, and everyone else for joining with me in this conversation. I think everyone's kind of set the stage for already what you guys are doing in your respective fields, and it's quite fantastic that everyone seems to be on the same page when it comes to de-radicalization and or counterterrorism. But everyone does agree that a lot of these type of efforts do fail in a lot of instances, and we know that some people have lost faith in these type of approaches of de-radicalization. I remember after the London bombings, the main psychologist involved in the de-radicalization program in the UK had practically given up and saying that the psychological approaches were not working. And to an extent, I also agree to that, picking one or two types of approaches do not actually work for something that is as complex as behavior, human behavior, in particular violent behavior. It's primitive, it's inherent. We've had it as a part of our, we've saved it as a part of our evolutionary growth from, all the way from little insects and birds and beasts to all the way to humans, along the primate line. We've kind of saved this evolutionarily. It's supposed to protect us. This type of violent behavior is supposed to guard us. But now, unfortunately, in the world, kind of world that we're living in, it's quickly become a menace. It's something that we need to target and get rid of. So it's not a single, psychology is one thing, and there's economics, political, and social sciences. We can go on and on about the jihadist doctrines of ISIS. But I believe that human behavior actually, if you don't study the brain of an individual, and the biology of an individual, not just the brain, but the brain and the biology of the individual, we cannot actually determine what makes a violent person violent. Because I'm not talking about radicalization here. Anybody can be a radical, and we've been long known about this, that not every radical engages in terrorism or the action of violence. There are only a few people who do so. And what makes them so? And a lot of people say that you get brainwashed through a specific political and religious process to come to this point. Well, who makes that decision? Who makes that choice that some people are more likely to get sieved through that particular jihadist doctrine and go all the way to the end, where what ISIS calls it as al-wala wal-bara, which is basically the final doctrine in ISIS. And afterwards, once you get trained into it, you can practically get them to do anything you like. So who decides this process, and what makes one thing that this person is actually a perfect fit for, or a good candidate to take this forward and actually make them commit a violent act? Now, I would like to make distinction between the violence in itself and the act of radicalization, because many people could be radicals. I'm going to only focus on the behavior, because we cannot measure through biology or through neuroscience, we cannot measure radicalization per se, but we can measure violence as a behavior. There are lots of people who have engaged in, brain scans, and a lot of, there are some in Aarhus as well. There are some in Denmark and some in the UK. They collaborate together, and I've gone through their studies. What they've measured is the intention of committing a violent act, of committing a jihadist act, but that's not how behavioral neurosciences are supposed to work. We're supposed to not measure the intention, but the action itself. And, so it's a combination of not just the brain, you're measuring the brain, measuring genetics, you're measuring hormones, you're measuring their environment, you're measuring the exposure to trauma, and all these different things. It's not like a simple divide between nature and nurture. It's much more complex than that. And all of this come together. We talk about the neurobiological sciences that could actually have an impact on someone's behavior. right? But before that, and before that, I'd like to make one large point that most people who engage in de-radicalization think of people as bimodally distributed, like good and evil, and a lot of people consider that. People who have a bias against certain community might think that, oh, Muslims are the bad people, or the other ones are the good people. People who might have bias against, say, Christian, fundamental Muslims who have bias against Christians or Hindus might think that these guys are bad and the other ones are good. But it's not a good or evil distribution. Every human has the capacity to be evil and good at the same time. In science, we've seen that through various experiments, and after the Holocaust in particular, we've had a lot of neurobiologists working on understanding human behaviors, where we could see what makes people evil. Right? Is it just a bad apple in the barrel, or the barrel is bad? That's if we put them in a certain situation, can we ruin all apples altogether? And that was a perfect example is prisons, large prisons. Guantanamo Bay, for example, was one of those where we created a bad barrel, and then there were many bad apples within that barrel. And some of those people who actually were the guards in Guantanamo Bay were perfect patriots in the U.S. And these perfect poster boys went on to do these grime actions and take photos with the prisoners and actually enjoy the charm of being violent to another person to that extent. Was quite fascinating for people like us to study that. How could that happen? So instead of having good and evil distribution, we need to look at a human that wants to just survive. So the need to survive is, or need to get derived pleasure out of something, is so much higher for individuals that the good and evil doesn't exist here. That there's no good person and there's no bad person in the world. So this is this is not just the Stanford prison experiment that I'm talking about, where these people were put together in basically a cellar of it was supposed to be university students. These universities, and this is in the 70s, they were put together in a cellar-like condition where half of them were made prisoners and half of them were made guards. And the prisoners started to behave like the prisoners eventually, and the guards started to behave like the guards. So it became like a mini 6-day Guantanamo Bay-like situation. Of course, they didn't go to that extent, but they did have a lot of violence in there. And in this study kind of showed that how regular, normal people in certain circumstances could become this way. And when you, especially when you blame the authority for it, like for example, a lot of the jihadis or even the neo-Nazis, they could blame a bigger cause, a bigger authority who's actually, the leader who's guiding them through this process. You remove the blame of the crime from an individual, and you kind of detach that whatever was done, okay, it was Hitler, we didn't do it as Nazi supporters, it was the leader of the jihadist movement. So the regular people in the terrorist organization could be de-identified. So the obedience to authorities, as grim as this, the story about bad barrels as a whole, what environment they're in, and how could regular people, and because they're regular, a lot of the researchers who studied ISIS returnees have told that this is the mainstream. The regular people, they're not psychopaths, they're not sociopaths. There could be the grimly evil kind of violent people in there, but that's just an odd, that's just a rarity. But the majority of them are just perfectly normal, healthy people. And psychology cannot categorize them under a sociopathic or any of those labels. So how do we measure them? And we've seen in our experiments, and we're going as little as to study the biology from mice and rats all the way to the to the primate behavior, and to the humans, in how this practice of aggression as this motivational, rewarding, pleasure-giving aggression, which is very typical of terrorist violence, is actually linked to specific areas of the brain and specific brain receptors of the brain. And when these are activated in conjunction with the biology and with the barrel, so-called the environment, you have a certain individual. So if we're going to remove entire brain behavior interaction from the whole de-radicalization setup, I genuinely think that people are missing out, particularly people who are involved in these organizations. You know, I understand there is a role of political and social sciences, economics, but we know that the economics do not justify why someone is going to become a violent extremist, right? We've known since long that poor or rich doesn't matter. For example, the Sri Lankans, recent Sri Lankan attacks, they were quite well off. And so poverty doesn't enable you to become something like that. So I think we need to have a somewhat holistic approach where we are engaging, not just from the civil society and the community. We have transparent data. The recidivism rates in particular are super important because most people, most countries, and most programs don't actually give out those rates. And I think somewhere in Europe they're between 2.9 to 8% recidivism, but actually how much of these are secretly guarded, we don't know. But if you look at violent behavior from the United States prisons, a lot of them range between 40 to 60%. So if the rates of, the chances of becoming violent again after going through a sentence is about 40 to 60%, then we're really in a lot of trouble if we're talking the same about the violent extremists. So for scientists and for behavioral sciences, this is very much like an addiction process. And the way that we get rid of people's addiction, like of alcohol or methamphetamine or other drugs, this is the same way that violent extremism should be looked at. And the sciences of the behavior and the neurobiology should be incorporated in addition with all the other wonderful work that people are doing. And of course,
thank you, Maya. Thank you, Maya.
Yeah, that is required. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think in the interest of time, I think we'll move to questions. We've got a whole stream of questions which have been coming through from audience members. So what I'll do is just run through as many as we can get to, and I'll put out to all of the panelists. So the first question here is, if law enforcement agencies are not best to steer programs, then who should be leading it and how? And I guess maybe to make this question even more specific, what kinds of practitioners should be leading these programs? I'm very happy to throw that open to any of the panelists who would like to jump in and answer that first. Go ahead, Eric.
I'm happy to jump in. That's a very good question. And I think in many respects, it's going to be those professionals that have sort of the best access and are most trusted and have maybe pre-existing relationships with the community or family members or even the individual. And in some cases, this could be a social worker. In some cases, this could be a youth worker. In some cases, it could be a mental health professional. It's just going to really depend on the context, and that's why it's really important, I think, to have in place these multi-agency or multi-actor intervention programs that are not necessarily developed solely for this purpose, but exist to support individuals who are of concern or on the path to becoming violent, have become violent, and you can sort of, based on an assessment of the individual's needs and risks, you then, and wider sort of ecosystem, you then determine which professional is the best place to do this. And it's often not going to be a law enforcement, but it can, in some cases, be law enforcement, depending on the relationship local police have with community members. In some cases, it can be very strong. In most cases, it's probably not that strong, but you shouldn't exclude the police from the outset as potential partners here. In many contexts, they could be valuable partners. So that's
great. Thanks so much, Eric. And there's a related question which I'm going to direct towards Sajid, just in terms of Indian experience. There's a question which is, where does it make sense to house disengagement programs at the state, district, panchayat level in rural areas in India, or at all levels with coordinated actions? How should this be structured in an Indian context?
So I think the best answer to this would be, it does not matter at what level you structure the program, but I think I tend to agree with Eric here. where at what level do have the agencies or the experts have the best access to the vulnerable groups or to the group which you are targeting in terms of de-radicalization. So it can be at any level. It can be at the village level. It can be at a city level. Because maybe in a city there are few areas where you want to focus it, and the law enforcement agencies, as you said, Arik said, mentioned, in that area has a very good rapport. Traditionally, has had a very good rapport with the community there. So it the levels of intervention, I think, matter less. What matters more is what is the quality of intervention, and whether the intervention is in fact needed or not. I'm going to keep coming back to is that whether the intervention is needed or not is also very important, and it has to be we keep on saying holistic. I think it's sometimes it's important to de-aggregate what holistic actually means. Is, to my knowledge, to my understanding, it has to be a civil society law enforcement mix, wherein both are and it depends on the situation, whether law enforcement agencies can steer a program or be in the background, just guide it, and kind of point indicators to the civil society members. So it has to be I think it has to be a holistic mix wherein both law enforcement agencies and civil society, take it forward.
Great, thank you, Sajid. I have a question here. I'm just going to read the question directly and open up to anyone on the floor. The question is, radical Islamic ideology propounded by groups like ISIS is religion-based ideology. Hence, should it not be countered within the religion, as outside interference could be counterproductive? That's the question in quotes. So can I throw that out to any of the speakers to address around religion? Thank you, Sajid. Go ahead.
So it's an interesting question, and this question, I think it's kind of it's a reflective of what we are dealing with. One is radical Islamic ideology. So what is radical Islamic ideology? The context keeps changing. 20 years ago, Muslim Brotherhood was a radical Islamic organization. When there was revolution in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood certainly became a less radical. So it's based on the context, what exactly, how much radical is radical. And here, what Sumaya mentioned about, she said that Wala and Bara are these two cornerstone of ISIS ideology. But where do these terms come from? If you go through, if you read the Islamic literature from medieval times, Wala and Bara is kind of, Wala means loyalty towards your own, and Bara means a rejection of the others. So this is not a cornerstone of radical or of Islamic ideology or Islamic doctrine. This became, it is the modern political, the way it has been formulated in the modern political context, wherein you have an ally and you have an enemy. Traditionally, it has been in the pre-Islamic times, it was used for making alliances. So the way it has been given a modern political kind of a turn is, you are aligned with somebody and you are rejecting somebody. And how do you align with somebody? Is, your co-religionist is somebody who you align more closely with. So once we understand these terms, like what is radical, what is ideology, how radical is an ideology, and does radicalization or radical ideology means violence? So understanding these terms is important, and I completely agree with Mr. Tripathi there. If there is an ideological issue, then who's the most competent to tackle that ideological? If there is ideological misinformation, then the people who understand the ideology are best suited and to counter that, or to do a pushback against it. And we have these examples happening around us as we see older jihadist ideologues getting into conversation on these terms, and this is a very fascinating conversation which keeps happening within the jihadi portals on these ideological issues.
I'd like to add something to that.
Samaya, did you want to? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Sajid as well that there was something else before the particular doctrine that we talked about, but now they've been framed to look at as obedience to authority, obedience to Muslims and the leaders, specifically when people get trained into the ISIS ideology and the framework. So because it becomes obedience to authority, they, as I said earlier, they get de-identified, and the blame can directly go onto the authority, whoever the present authority is for that group. It is less of a guilt or a shameful act for the individual who engages in violence, for them to consider that the shame that comes with the action of violence or terrorism is lessened, so to speak. And definitely, you would require the help of religious leaders, but there's another layer to it, that because this is this type of addiction like violence where one thing finishes and the other opens up, people keep moving from, it's called cult hopping, and this is very common in the Nazis as well, the neo-Nazis, I would say, along through the 90s up to what neo-Nazis are now in 2020. Cult hopping has been taken place since forever. So when they're disillusioned with one type of ideology, they would move on to go and join something else, and that's happened with Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and back now in Afghanistan. People have moved from Bosnia and Chechnya and back to Afghanistan since the 90s. So cult hopping is very popular, and for those who are actually addicted or in this type of violence, will keep doing regardless of the ideology. It's just a matter of alignment with the group or not. So it's more than the religion here, and it's more than, and at the end of the day, what we should be looking at is not celebrate violence, and not think of this as, or any type of violence, whether it comes from Muslims or Hindus or the far right Christians or Nazis, not to celebrate this type of violence and actually remove that from any political debate. This is not the way to resolve issues per se. So if that's what happens, then I think that's probably a way to move forward.
Thank you, Samaya. I've got a big question here. What if the majority of society is radicalized, when people have deep-rooted prejudices that are normalized in the majority of mainstream society? I'll throw that again to any of the panelists who would like to respond to that.
I guess we could.
Everyone's hesitating to answer such a big question.
It is. It's very difficult to answer in 2 minutes. But I could say that radicalism and obviously violence are two different things. But if there is a scientific opposite of hate, it's not love, and people say we should win it with love. The scientific equivalent and opposite of hate is indifference. And and that's what we should be trying to achieve. It's not to fill it with love, because it's so subjective. Everybody's experiences are different, and people who feel victimized and go into this victimhood category will adopt any ideology, whether it's religious ideology or there is a recent non-religious ideology, I'm not sure if you've heard about it, called incels. It's a group of people who are basically anti-women and engage in some sort of violent acts. And it doesn't have to be religion. It could be any ideology or any driver to become violent. And so I don't think we can answer that that kind of a question in a simple form. But don't try to counter it with love. We have to achieve indifference towards these extremist ideas.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, just
sorry, Eric, I might actually go to Jesse first, just to make sure we hear Jesse before we end. Sorry, Eric.
I was just going to say really quickly, one thing that Hidayah is very, adamant about is it's one thing to be radicalized, but it's also one thing when it's radicalization that leads to violent extremism. So a community can be radicalized, or you can have radicalized thoughts. But if you're not acting in a violent manner or committing any kind of terrorist, crimes or endangering a population, then you need to separate that out, because there is definitely a separation between those two, and it's something that I think that people do need to make sure that there is a separation between those two of radicalization, and then radicalization that is actually leading to an act of terrorism or an act of violent extremism. So that's just something that I wanted to add.
Thanks, Jesse. And Eric,
Thank
I will
you.
go to you for the final word.
Sure. Just quickly, I think this question is actually an important one in the sense of when you're targeting disengagement programs or de-radicalization programs against an individual, you have to be mindful of the wider community and the family and the social network that he or she is going to be reintegrated into, and to make available some types of programs to support that community, which may in and itself be somewhat radicalized. And if you try to reintegrate an individual after having just disengaged them, and you reintegrate them into a community where the seeds of radicalization to violence still exist, then the disengagement process could backfire. And so I think it's really important to understand this wider community dynamic. And while yes, what Jesse says is correct, that the concern of law enforcement is only when the radicalization that leads to violence and terrorism, I think the concern for those who want to effectively disengage individuals has to be a bit broader than that. And if there is a larger community that is still sort of supporting a very radical sort of worldview, reintegrating a violent extremist back into that community may be a mistake.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. I think with that, we will wrap up just 1 minute until close. Thank you so much, Jesse, Eric, Sumaya, Sajid, for your time. Thank you so much to Maya and the team at ORF for hosting this event. And I hope this leaves everyone with some food for thought around how to best structure de-radicalization programs. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.